Hey guys, in this video the lovely Tim is going to be talking to you about eyewitness accounts, how they're important and what things influence them. This is all for your A-level psychology. Now there are lots of things to remember in this video, and if you want some help remembering all of the tricky bits that you need to, over on my website there are loads of multiple choice questions just perfectly designed to help you remember things.
Eyewitness testimony is often abbreviated, especially by psychologists but also in the legal world, to EWT. And we can define it as this: the recall of specific events by an individual who was present. They witnessed that event. As you probably expect, eyewitness testimony is crucial in all aspects of the law, both criminal and civil trials. In both types of trial, there are very strict rules around what types of evidence are permitted. Eyewitness testimony is crucial to securing guilt or securing innocence and proving guilt or innocence. Even with the many advances in technology like DNA evidence, we still have to rely in court on eyewitness testimony. EWT relies on our recall, that is, using our memory to recall specific facts, such as the height, hair colour or eye colour of an individual, or where they were at a specific time. Unfortunately, witnesses are often inaccurate when describing events. As we've already seen, the process of recall is not perfect, and they often either misremember or outright forget and omit details. This can have massive and profound implications on trials. Poor eyewitness testimony can lead to the guilty walking free or the innocent being convicted. Without eyewitness testimony, it can be very difficult to prove innocence or guilt, and a miscarriage of justice is likely. EWT is crucial. A very key area of cognitive psychology is therefore improving eyewitness testimony and trying to work out what factors have an effect on the accuracy and the reliability of this testimony. In 1974, Loftus and Palmer did some research to investigate eyewitness testimony. This experiment used what we call leading questions. A leading question is a question which is designed to guide the respondent towards a specific answer. They are inherently biased. This was done to test how eyewitness testimony could be distorted by these leading questions. Two experiments were actually carried out in this study. They were separate, but they were related. In experiment 1, participants were shown film footage of a car crash. They were then asked how fast they thought the cars were going when they hit. Hit is a fairly neutral word. It doesn't have any connotations. It's a factual description of events of a car crash. The two cars hit. But then the word hit was swapped out for different words: smashed, collided, bumped, or contacted. Each of these words has a slightly different connotation or meaning. Participants in the group where smashed was used gave a higher average speed. As you may expect, the word smashed seems to suggest that the two cars were travelling at speed, while those in the group where contacted was used gave a lower average speed. Again, this is something you may expect. The word contacted doesn't have those connotations of high speeds. In the second experiment, participants were shown the same footage, and they were split into three groups. One group was given no indication of the speed the cars were going. These were a control group to establish a baseline. The second group was told that they smashed together, and the third group was told that they hit. And again, the words hit and smashed have significant connotations. A week later, each group was asked a specific question. They were asked if they saw any broken glass. There was no broken glass in the film at all, but those in the smashed group were more likely to say that they did see some, even though they hadn't. The main conclusion from this piece of research is obviously that leading questions can have a massive impact on how any witness recalls a specific event. This in turn has a huge and profound influence on evidence in trials. It's therefore important to wider society. The impact of leading questions and how they can lead a witness astray is quite often why lawyers and barristers in an actual courtroom will object to leading questions being used when cross-examining a witness. It can colour and distort their testimony away from the truth. One notable thing to consider is that this experiment was essentially artificial. The participants hadn't actually seen a real-life car crash happening in front of them in real time. That may have put them in danger, and it would have been unethical. They may have suffered stress. Had they done this, however, their answers may have been different. Not necessarily more accurate or more reliable, but different. That said, however, the experiment did have at least some level of ecological validity. A car crash is a real-life event which happens all the time. It wasn't a completely artificial scenario. But the participants may have simply been showing what we call demand characteristics. By that, we mean that they may have been answering in the way that they thought the researcher would want them to. Sometimes this is also called observer or observation bias, where the presence of a researcher or observer affects the results you get and the behavior of the participants. It's something which is quite hard to avoid, especially in psychology. Another possibility is that there was no internal validity. By that we mean that the participants have guessed the purpose of the questions and they've acted accordingly out of a desire to fit in and be right, something that we saw a lot in social influence, and is also a possibility here. In 1975, so a year after Loftus's original research, a second piece of research was done by Loftus and Zani. They looked at how specific words can have an influence on eyewitness testimony and its accuracy. Once again, they used the scenario of a car crash. However, again, they used film of a car crash rather than actual one happening before the participants. This time, however, the participants were asked one of two questions. The first question was, did you see the broken headlight? The second question was, did you see a broken headlight? Very similar, but also very different. Participants who were asked question 1 using the saw a broken headlight 17% of the time. There was actually no broken headlight in the film at all. Participants who were asked question 2 using a saw a broken headlight only 7% of the time, less than half. This was a laboratory experiment, so there was good control of variables, and it's highly unlikely that a third, unknown outside factor was influencing these results. There is some ecological validity to this experiment as well. It is a possible scenario outside of a lab, but again, participants were only shown a film of the crash. They may have responded differently or more accurately to a real crash. One of the many theories of how eyewitness testimony is affected is that of post-event information. Post-event information is when more information is revealed or given to witnesses after the actual event has taken place. This information may be true, but more often it may be false, in which case we term it misleading post-event information. Obviously, this is likely to have an effect on the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. Cher led a group of researchers in 1997 do a similar experiment to those that had been done previously on eyewitness testimony, but this time the participants viewed a planned and staged robbery. After this, a confederate was introduced. And remember, a confederate is somebody who appears to be a real, genuine participant, but is actually somebody working for the researcher, who has full knowledge of what's going on and the method of the experiment. This confederate responded to questions with information that was either deliberately accurate or deliberately false. When the participant went first and answered before the confederate questions, their recall was accurate 58% of the time, a little under 2/3. When the confederate went first and gave accurate information in response to questions, participants were accurate 67% of the time, a little bit more than initially. However, critically, when the confederate went before the participants to answer questions and gave false information, participants were only accurate 42% of the time, less than half and 16% lower than when there was no confederate giving answers before them. We can make a conclusion from this. The information given after the actual event by the confederate had a big influence on the accuracy of EWT, of eyewitness testimony. As always, this was a laboratory study, even though it used a staged robbery, and there was good control of variables. A causal relationship, a cause and effect factor, could be established between post-event information and accuracy of testimony. But, as always with lab studies, there was very little ecological validity, and there was an obvious ethical issue, firstly in misleading the participants into believing that the robbery was real rather than planned, and secondly, in planning a robbery. Another idea about eyewitness testimony, which is similar to post-event information but slightly different, is post-event discussion. Post-event discussion is when information which may be misleading or it may be accurate is gained through a general conversation after the event, just in normal human discussion. Gabbert in 2004 led a group of researchers in a study involving two groups of participants. Both of them watched a staged crime, something we've seen before. They were then exposed to false information about that crime in one of two different ways. The first of the two groups was exposed to this information through a general conversation with a confederate. Group 2 was exposed to this information through a written report. which they thought had been written by another participant, but was actually written by the Confederate. It had been written by the researchers. Accurate recall of events, and so accurate eyewitness testimony, was much lower in the group which had been exposed to inaccurate information through general conversation. That had had a large impact on how accurately they recalled events. The written report did have an effect. It did reduce the accuracy, but it was to a much smaller extent than conversation. Another possible factor that might impact on eyewitness testimony is age. That may seem obvious. Our memories change and fade as we progressively get older. But in 1997, Valentine and Coxon did some research to establish what the precise pattern was, or even if there was a link between age and eyewitness testimony. This study was done specifically to find out, therefore, how much the age of a witness impacts on the accuracy of the testimony that they give. 3 groups of participants watched a video of a staged kidnapping. The 3 groups were children, adults, and elderly people. Each group was then asked a series of questions about what they'd seen. Some of these questions were leading. What colour hat was the kidnapper wearing is an example. That's a leading question because it assumes that the kidnapper was wearing a hat. Some of these questions were the opposite. They weren't leading questions. An example would be, was the kidnapper wearing a hat? Which assumes nothing. Both children and the elderly gave more incorrect answers to non-leading questions, and children were misled more by leading questions than adults or the elderly. What's critical is that adults who weren't children or the elderly were misled less than the other 2 groups by leading questions. Unusually for research in psychology, this research was able to present a very strong single conclusion. Age is definitely a factor in influencing how accurate EWT is. This conclusion has massive ramifications in the legal world. It means that children or the elderly are at least theoretically less reliable as witnesses, although obviously this will vary between individuals. If we take it in another way, it also means that adults are more reliable as witnesses. Their eyewitness testimony is more accurate and more reliable. As always, this study was done under laboratory conditions, so there was very good control of the variables, and therefore a reduced chance that a third unknown random variable was influencing the whole results and biasing the study. But this study was artificial. The participants were fortunately not witnessing an actual kidnapping. This may mean that the study has some limited ecological validity. It may mean that the same results wouldn't happen in a real-world scenario. There's no easy way to know. It's also possible that all of the participants recalled events less accurately because they watched a video of a kidnapping rather than an actual one. Obviously, there is an ethical issue with this study. You're asking children or the elderly to watch a potentially disturbing and distressing event. Even if it's a video of a staged kidnapping, they are still witnessing a kidnapping. Other than age, another possible factor which may affect the accuracy and reliability of eyewitness testimony is anxiety, sometimes also called emotional arousal. The general belief among psychologists and also among the general public is that small amounts of anxiety and emotional arousal has a tendency to increase the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. It makes it more likely that we will accurately recall events. However, as you may expect, severe or extreme anxiety or stress or emotional arousal has the opposite effect. It reduces that accuracy. It makes our eyewitness testimony and how we recall events less accurate and less reliable. Obviously, in violent crimes, there is a very high amount of emotional arousal present among witnesses. They therefore show a reduced accuracy of recall. That high anxiety and high stress makes them less likely to accurately recall events, especially immediately following the event itself. One theory about this is that they fixate on small and effectively random details, so this could be the weapon used. That's fine, but in doing so, they ignore other details which may be critical, such as the description of the criminal, how tall they were, what they were wearing, for example. There is therefore, at least theoretically, an ideal amount of arousal, of anxiety or emotional arousal, which is ideal. Just enough to raise accuracy of memory, but not so much that a witness begins to fixate on random small details. Of course, this has implications in a legal setting in trials. If a questioning lawyer can prove that a witness was in a high state of stress or emotional arousal, then it does bring into question the validity of that eyewitness testimony. Their high levels of stress or anxiety may have caused them to inaccurately remember events. Loftus, who, as we've already seen in this video, has done a lot of work and research around eyewitness testimony, did a study in 1979 to indicate and look into how much witnesses focused on the weapon in a crime. This was done with an independent group design, groups that are asked similar questions or undergo a similar process independently of each other to establish a trend or see differences and similarities between them. The participants were divided into 2 different rooms, so the groups were physically separated. Each group heard an animated and very loud discussion or argument in a nearby room, close enough so they clearly hear what was going on. The participants in the first group then saw a man leave the room holding a pen and with greasy hands. But the participants in group 2 saw a man leave the room holding a large knife and with blood on his hands. Both these groups, the ones that saw a man leave just holding a pen and the ones that saw a man leave holding a weapon, were asked to identify the man they had seen from a range of photographs. Participants in group 1 were accurate about half the time, 49%. Half the time they correctly identified the man they had seen. But participants in group 2 were much less accurate. They only correctly identified the man they'd seen about 1/3, 33% of the time. Loftus concluded that when witnesses are anxious or emotionally aroused or stressed, they focus on a weapon over all other details. This study does have high ecological validity. Participants didn't know that the discussion was staged. They thought they were there for completely different research when they overheard this staged discussion. Obviously, the blood was fake. However, unusually, this study had high ecological validity while being under laboratory conditions. There was very good control of the variables. Naturally, however, and hopefully obviously, there was an ethical problem with this study. Firstly, participants were misled. They were misled into thinking that the blood and the knife were real and that the argument discussion was real. They may also have been extremely distressed or scared by the events they saw. Seeing a man come past you covered in blood with a knife is not something that happens every day, and it's possible that that may have had long-term consequences on their mental health, a serious ethical issue for this study. Everything that we've looked at so far about eyewitness testimony does have its detractors, and there are alternate theories about what impacts on eyewitness testimony. There's some disagreement about how much misleading questions, emotional arousal actually influence recall and EWT. These theories that we've already seen are not universal. They're not accepted by everybody in psychology. For example, a study done by Ewell and Kutschel in 1986 appeared to show that witnesses were far more accurate when the incident was real rather than when it was staged. This would have implications on all of the research done previously, most of which used staged events. This study was a field study. It happened with actual events in the real world, and therefore it had a very high amount of ecological validity. The event used was the shooting of a burglar by police, a real event. The witnesses actually witnessed that shooting of that burglar. Witnesses to that event were later interviewed, about 5 months after the event they witnessed by the researchers. Incredibly, their recall was found to be astonishingly accurate and detailed, even after nearly half a year has passed. They recalled random but very accurate details about what the man was wearing and how and where he was shot. When misleading questions were introduced by researchers, it was found that the accuracy of that recall was completely unaffected. The people they interviewed continued to give accurate information, even when misleading questions were used to try and lead them astray. Obviously, this study had very high ecological validity. It used a real-life event that actually happened rather than being under laboratory conditions. But the witnesses who showed the highest anxiety were also understandably the witness who had been physically closest to the actual event, the actual shooting of the burglar. Therefore, it's possible that 2 different things could have caused them to be so accurate: proximity, how close they were, and anxiety, their emotional arousal. And it's not really possible to distinguish between them. We can't tell which one of them caused the accuracy. Obviously, there's an ethical implication to this study. They used an actual killing and actual witnesses in research. They may have been stressed or disturbed at the time, and asking them these questions so many months later may have caused them severe mental health issues. Cognitive psychologists, that is, psychologists who study brain function and brain patterns, have been a large part in helping to increase both the reliability and the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, which also has an impact on the criminal justice system. We already know that EWT is affected by a great many factors. We've already looked at age, anxiety, emotional arousal, possibly proximity. The cognitive interview technique, sometimes called CIT, was developed by Gieselman, leading a group of researchers, in 1984. Its purpose was to try and maximize the validity and the accuracy of eyewitness testimony to improve the criminal justice system. This CIT, or cognitive interview technique, follows a set process. Firstly, the interviewer tries to make the witness as physically comfortable and mentally relaxed as is possible. They tailor their use of language for this purpose. Secondly, the witness mentally recreates the scene of the crime. That's both externally, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the things around them, but also internally as well, their mood at the time and what they were feeling. Number 3, the witness reports everything that they recall about the events. Regardless of how incredibly relevant any detail seems to be to them, they still pass it on to the interviewer. It may be important and it helps them in recalling events. Fourthly, the witness tries to recall the events in as many different orders as possible, chronologically, from first to last, but also backwards, from last to first. Number 5, the witness then also tries to recall the events from as many different perspectives as possible, such as from their own perspective, but also from the perspective of other witnesses, the victim, or even the perpetrator of the crime. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, in contrast to standard police interviews, the interviewer conducting the CIT avoids any comments or questions that would be insulting, that would be judgmental, that would be personal, or critically, that would be leading. This technique is designed to increase the accuracy of EWT. Following on from the development of the CIT in 1984, Gieselman led a group of researchers a year later to try and establish how useful the CIT actually was in helping witnesses be accurate and reliable when they were giving testimony. This research used a planned and staged event, as so many pieces of research in eyewitness testimony. An intruder carrying a blue rucksack entered a classroom and stole an important piece of equipment. The participants were present in this classroom and they believed that this event was unplanned. They didn't believe it was part of the research. This study used an independent groups design. Participants were divided into 2 separate and independent groups that were asked different questions that witnessed things separately. Group 1 was questioned using the normal standard police interview process. They were just asked questions, some of which were leading. But Group 2 was questioned using the cognitive interview technique, the technique that we've already looked through the process of, designed to extract the maximum of information. Early in the questions, both groups were asked the same question. Was the guy with the green rucksack nervous? Remember that the rucksack had actually been blue. Later in the questions, both groups were asked what colour the rucksack had been. Group 2, who remember had been interviewed using the cognitive interview technique, CIT, were more accurate. They recalled that the rucksack wasn't green more often. Group 1, who had been interviewed using a normal, standard police interview method, were much less accurate. They recalled that the rucksack had been green more often. The CIT therefore does reduce the effect of leading questions. In doing so, it makes eyewitness testimony more reliable and more accurate. This study was conducted under laboratory conditions, and therefore, as we've seen, there was very good control of the variables. Unusually, however, this study used what was in effect a real crime, that of theft. The participants were not Confederates, and they didn't know that this theft was staged. This increased the ecological validity of the research. It may be more true in the real world. However, the use of independent groups does introduce a possibility. That possibility is that the results were merely down to random individual differences, rather than an overall trend. This is theoretically and mathematically possible, but it is unlikely that all the people in Group 2 had better memories. Lastly, there is, of course, an ethical issue with this study. Participants were misled. They were misled into thinking that the theft they witnessed was real and unplanned and not part of the experiment. It's also possible that some or all of them may have been stressed or confused by the events that they witnessed.